Welcome back to another episode of Epistemics. We are joined by Hamza, Andreas, Jortes. I think I've said it finally right after all of those years of knowing you, bro.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah. What does that mean, first and foremost? If you want to just let our...
What, my surname?
No, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
I'm only kidding. It means may the peace and blessings of God be with you.
Brilliant. Okay, so, bro, today I want to talk about a topic which you have done a lot of research on. You've put together an argument on, you've written about it in your book, The Divine Reality. It's a topic that some popular atheists have really spoken about a lot too. Daniel Dennett, Sam Harris, and the list goes on. And they have shared their views on this. What I want to do in this short video, speaking to our audience, those individuals that may be confused about this topic, that may not know much about it, they may be confused about the hard problem, the other problem, and this problem, and that problem, to really break it down for them and really explain what the hard problem of consciousness is, what the argument from consciousness is, and just give us a bit of a background on it.
Okay, Bismillah, in the name of God. Basically, this argument is not what you call a conclusive argument. However, it is something that raises a lot of questions, specifically against the naturalistic worldview. What is philosophical naturalism or ontological naturalism? It is the worldview that there is no divine, there is no supernatural, and everything can be explained by or reduced to physical processes, but not specifically physical stuff. Yeah. Now, this argument of consciousness has different conceptions. The conception I like to talk about is the argument from the hard problem of consciousness, if you like. So what is the hard problem?
Yeah.
Before we talk about the hard problem, let's talk about the easy problems. Science and neurobiological studies have done great things, and they've uncovered lots of different things concerning our cognitive faculties, the fact that we have thoughts and that we have rational insights and all of these things.
Yeah.
However, those are the easy problems. The hard problem is what you would call phenomenal consciousness.
Yeah.
In English language, the fact that we have inner subjective conscious states, right?
Okay.
So for example, imagine I gave you, imagine this is a chocolate, okay? I want you to eat that chocolate.
Okay, I've eaten it.
Come on, let's see it act, okay? Swallow it. Good.
Tastes
So, if I
really
were to-
nice.
so exactly, really nice.
It's really nice, yeah.
So that kind of subjective experience is the hard problem. In what way? Because there is something that it is like to be in when you're having a chocolate. So you are experiencing an inner subjective conscious state when you're having a chocolate.
Okay, so I'm tasting it.
Yes. So I may even ask you, what does it taste like? And you may
Yeah.
say it's sweet. You may say it's crunchy. You may say it's smooth,
Yeah.
right? But words are vehicles to meaning,
Yeah.
and meaning is a representation of our subjectivity. Because smooth and sweet to you is something, right?
Yeah.
You're undergoing an inner subjective
I'm
conscious
experiencing
state.
something
Yes.
when I'm using those words to describe
Exactly.
that
It's a
experience.
first person experience. You could
Yeah.
call it a first person fact even,
Okay.
yeah? I am experiencing something, and that thing is sweet and smooth and crunchy all
Okay.
at the same time, for example. That's an inner subjective conscious state. Now, the hard problem is we don't know what it's like for you to have that inner subjective conscious state. I know what it's like for me to have the chocolate, but I don't know what it's like for you. There is a gap, if you like, a gap of knowledge. They call it the epistemic gap. But also for me, there is another question, another problem in the hard problem of consciousness, which is, why do you have an inner subjective conscious state arising from cold, seemingly non-conscious physical processes? So there's the issue of, I don't know what it's like for Imran to have an inner subjective conscious state, in this case, a chocolate, eating a chocolate. And we don't know why and how
Yeah.
you have those inner subjective conscious experiences
Yeah.
arising from seemingly cold, non-conscious, neurobiological, physical stuff.
So you're saying there's two problems here.
There are two questions that form the hard problem of
Okay, so
consciousness.
the first is that personal experience that I have, which is personal to me.
Yeah, so we don't know what it's like for you to have an inner subjective conscious state.
Right, okay. And the second one is,
And we don't know
why it arises.
why that inner subjective conscious state arises from physical
But
processes.
there's an assumption here on your part.
Or even how, really.
Yeah, but some atheists would argue there's an assumption on your part, Hamza. What you're saying, or you're assuming, that consciousness is this separate entity from the material brain, right? For Daniel Dennett, for example, here would argue probably down the lines of, well, you're assuming it's something separate. It's just something that stems from the material brain itself. It's a part of the brain. It's just neurons firing, and it's that activity which is is manifesting in you what you're calling consciousness. It's not something separate.
That is true. However, some assumptions are stronger than others. So, for example, I would say, okay, Dan Dennett, if you adopt an approach to the philosophy of the mind, which is called eliminative materialism, you just believe it's all brain.
Yeah.
You actually believe that inner subjective conscious states are just an illusion. You don't even believe they're a first-person fact. You believe they don't exist. They're just illusory. Well, if that's the case, then the more we know about the brain, the more we'll be able to know about Imran's inner subjective conscious state, and the more we'll be able to answer the question why that inner subjective conscious state arises from neurobiological processes.
Okay.
But we don't. That's the point. And the more we know, I would even argue you will never know. Because if you study neuroscience as a subfield of science, and imagine I were to map out all the neurochemical firings in your brain, right? I've mapped them all out, bro. Every time you say sweet, crunchy, smooth, sweet, crunchy, smooth, every time you say that when you're eating a chocolate, I've mapped out the whole of your brain. Okay. So understanding where all these neurons are firing and all this electrochemical activity is going on, right? What's happening in your brain doesn't lead me to the knowledge of what it's like for you to have a chocolate.
Right. Okay.
Because neurobiology, neuroscience is a study of correlation, right? So I can know everything about your brain.
Yeah.
How does that now lead me to knowledge of what it's like for you to have an inner subjective conscious experience? And how does it answer the question, why does that inner subjective conscious experience arise? Why does it arise from neurobiological stuff?
Right. Okay.
That's the point. So if it's just the brain, then okay, well then you should be able to answer these questions. And I would argue it's a bit of a cop-out because many philosophers of the mind, they're moving away from eliminative materialism and they're appreciating that we do have this first-person fact, which is called an inner subjective conscious experience. You can't just throw that out of the way. You can't deny what makes you human. And that's the problem when you have an excessive physicalist and naturalistic view on the world. You start to deny what makes you human, right? Which is, I have inner subjective conscious experiences, right?
Okay.
So, yeah, you're right. In philosophy, there's assumptions behind everything, but some assumptions are more coherent than others, right?
Okay, I think at this point, I want to play you a clip of Sam Harris.
Absolutely.
And I think his view, this brings into play his view now, because we've dealt with...
Who's Sam Harris?
Sam Harris is...
I'm joking.
Okay, you obviously know who Sam Harris is. But let me just play this for you. Go ahead.
Objective. I'm not arguing that consciousness is a reality beyond science or beyond the brain, or that it floats free of the brain at death. I'm not making any spooky claims about its metaphysics. What I am saying, however, is that the self is an illusion, the sense of being an ego, an I, a thinker of thoughts in addition to the thoughts, an experiencer in addition to the experience. That the sense that we all have of riding around inside our heads as a kind of a passenger in the vehicle of the body. That's where most people start when they think about any of these questions. I mean, most people don't feel identical to their bodies. They feel like they have bodies. They feel like they're inside the body, and most people feel like they're inside their heads. Now that sense of being a subject, a locus of consciousness inside the head, is an illusion. It makes no neuroanatomical sense. There's no place in the brain for your ego to be hiding. We know that everything you experience, your conscious emotions and thoughts and moods and the impulses that initiate behavior, all of these things are delivered by myriad different processes in the brain that are spread out over the whole of the brain, that they can be independently erupted. We have a changing system. We are a process. And there's
I think that's sufficient there. Now, his view is quite interesting because he sort of bridges the gap between what you're saying and Dennett's saying in a way, right? So he acknowledges consciousness, that it's a separate entity in some way to the brain itself, although it may be linked in some way. But he then goes on to say that the self, the I, that observer of experiences, is an illusion.
Okay.
So what do you take from, what do you make from this?
Well, it's interesting, but obviously this is a short clip, and I'm
Yeah.
sure he has some kind
By the way,
of...
this is 2014, so maybe he's changed his
Maybe,
views.
but
yeah,
I'm
so-
sure he has some kind of justification for his views. But from what I understand, his view echoes eliminative materialism to some degree, which basically says the self
Yeah.
or the experience of a self
Yeah.
or subjective experience is illusory, and it's just fundamentally just neurochemicals firing.
Mm.
And we're going to replace language such as, subjective language, we're going to replace it with scientific type language,
Yeah.
right? And for me, I just think it's just counterintuitive,
Yeah.
right? Like, you may argue, well, some intuitions are wrong, but they can be for sure.
Yeah.
But, when you make such a bold claim, when an individual self is speaking and denying the individual
Yes.
self,
Yeah.
that becomes slightly problematic.
'Cause
for
he
me,
does go
because I
into
would
s-
ask him, if the
Yeah.
self is illusory, then who is speaking at the moment?
Yeah, and who's experiencing?
And who's
Because he
experiencing
does
it?
go
So-
on to say that if you can get to the point through meditation and through contemplation, you get to the point where you get to the point you're realizing that the self is an illusion. You become unaware of yourself, but then you can still experience things. And he uses still the pronouns, the first and second person pronouns, to refer to the self, like you said. So how can you be experiencing something without being aware of yourself?
I don't
and calling
know.
yourself an illusion?
I don't know what he's trying to do, but it sounds like, and I may be wrong in this,
Yeah.
but it sounds like that he's basically saying that you would experience oneness, right? And you lose yourself in this oneness when you meditate, I assume. But the problem with that is, well, who's experiencing the
Who's or
oneness?
what's experiencing?
Yeah, what's experiencing it. So look, at the end of the day, it's very hard to move away from that idea that there is an individual self.
Yes.
And that's why many philosophers of the mind, they wouldn't really walk down Sam Harris's path. Sam Harris is not a philosopher, from what I understand. He's a neuroscientist. And if you study neuroscience, you see it's just a study of correlation. One of my friends who's done an MSc in neuroscience, he calls neuroscience pixelated phrenology, which is basically, we don't know much about the brain.
What does that even mean?
Well, we just have a
Pixelated
pixelated
phenomenon.
understanding of what's happening in the brain,
Okay.
right? And it's just a science of correlations. And even when we think we've mapped something out, there are so many different material candidates happening in the brain that it's really even hard to pinpoint anything.
Yeah.
Yes, we're getting closer, and it's a great study.
Yeah.
But for me, I'm more interested in the metaphysics. Although
Yes.
the hard problem of consciousness is not only metaphysical, it's epistemic, because we don't know what it's like for you to have a chocolate.
Yeah.
But we also don't know why that inner subjective conscious experience arises from physical processes, which is more ontological,
Right.
the source and the nature of something. So, and I would even argue, even if you were to claim that you knew everything about the brain, it wouldn't solve the epistemic problem, yeah?
Right.
Because it links to an ontological problem, right? Because consciousness is fundamentally different, or our experiences are fundamentally different from physical code stuff.
Yes.
There are different approaches to the philosophy of the mind, of course. You have things like functionalism and reductive materialism and emergent materialism, the strong and the weak form. You have panpsychism, which is a little bit spooky, some may argue. You have different forms and different approaches to the philosophy of the mind. But what's interesting here is that you can't just rely on neuroscience. Even the atheist Professor Tallis, Raymond Tallis, he makes a really good point. He basically says, well, if you believe that what makes us human, and obviously I'm paraphrasing what he's saying, if you believe what makes us human can be reduced to physical processes, then, or can be explained by physical stuff, like neurobiological chemical happenings in the brain, well, you've actually adopted a hidden assumption. And that hidden assumption is that the brain is identical to inner subjective conscious states, or it's somehow similar,
Right.
or it's the same. That is a philosophical assumption. And that's why if you study neuroscience, you study, philosophers of the mind like Manzotti, Moderato, Rex Wilson, and others, they all agree. What's his name? Ravoncio. They agree that the neurobiological studies, neuroscience, is premised, has an assumption, and that assumption is physicalism. Now, physicalism is the view in the philosophy of the mind that consciousness can be reduced to, explained by physical processes and not necessarily bits of matter. And there's different conceptions of physicalism. Functionalism is a conception of physicalism. You have eliminative materialism. By the way, materialism, physicalism in the philosophy of the mind are used synonymously. They have different histories, but they're used synonymously in the literature. Point is, there's different conceptions, but they have to, neurobiological studies and neuroscience has to rest on that assumption. That assumption is not scientific.
Right.
Sam Harris, hopefully he admits, and many others, and many admit that neuroscience is based on an assumption, and that assumption is a philosophical one. It's a metaphysics. And I believe in order to really deal with this problem, you have to deal with the philosophy, with the metaphysics. Because anything I give you, if I give you any neurobiological study,
Yes.
it's going to rest on a philosophical assumption. That philosophical assumption needs explaining. Is it coherent?
Right.
I would argue, because of the hard problem of consciousness, and because of the fact, even if we were to know everything about the brain, it doesn't lead us to the understanding of what it's like for Imran to have a chocolate. And even if we knew everything about the brain, all the complex causal connections and the physical processes in the brain, even if we were to unravel all of that, we would still not know why and how subjective conscious states arise from physical processes. Then it becomes a kind of metaphysical problem. We need to basically address that by adopting a different type of philosophy, but at the same time appreciating that neuroscience works,
Right.
and that we should continue with that philosophy. So what I am what I'm more closer to, which I may be totally wrong by the way, is an integrative dualism, right? So dualism, an integrative dualism is that you have a metaphysics, which is, yes, consciousness is not the brain,
Okay.
but the relationship is like the driver and the car.
Okay.
Now, the car won't go anywhere if the driver's dead, right? If the driver's not there. And the car won't go anywhere, and the driver can't drive the car if the car's not working.
Sure.
Right? So they're both different. I'm different from my car and the car's different from me, but we both need each other for both of us to go somewhere, right?
Right.
So conscious and the brain has that kind of similar kind of relationship in that kind of way. They're different, but yet connected in some way. And at the same time, in order to fix the car, you have to do the physical stuff, right? But you appreciate that the human is different from the
car
mechanics
itself,
of the car. So integrative dualism, which, some philosophers are arguing, such as Taliaferro and others, they basically say your metaphysics, your first principles on how you see consciousness is that there is physical stuff, and there is this thing called consciousness that is connected to physical stuff, and it's required, but it's also very different.
Yeah.
And it appreciates all of the science. So what it does, it in a way solves the hard problem of consciousness in some way, which we could discuss later or another time. But it appreciates a different metaphysics. It doesn't have this kind of atheistic, physicalistic view on the world.
Isn't that similar to what Thomas Nagel sort of requests people to do in his book Mind and Cosmos, which is you can't take a hard line naturalistic outlook on these realities. You have to look at other alternatives as well.
Yeah, I mean, in his famous 1973 or 74 paper, which was called, if I'm correct, What It's Like to Be a Bat. Yeah. He was one of the kind of, his paper was a milestone paper concerning this whole problem of consciousness, and he was like, well, science is third person's objective, right?
Yes.
But consciousness, or the inner subjective conscious experience, phenomenal consciousness, this is first person fact. So how can you use a method that deals with the third person to basically understand the first person? Yeah. So that's the kind of, obviously it gets much more nuanced than that, and there are so many different discussions amongst the physicalists. You have the Bryan law, phenomenal concept strategy. You have so many, it goes into a lot of detail. But like with many things, he was on Big Think. It's a 6-minute, 52-second piece. He's not going to explain all of his neuroscience and philosophy in one go, so we have to be nuanced. But at the same time, I think if anyone's going to take anything from this video, is to understand that, don't be under the illusion that just because a neuroscientist has told you something and they found some chemicals firing in the brain, that they've answered the hard problem of consciousness. They haven't. Because if you study the philosophy of the mind and neuroscience properly, you would understand that neuroscience has philosophical metaphysical assumptions. There is no such thing as a philosophy-free or a first principles-free science, and that includes neuroscience. And neuroscience is dependent on a philosophical assumption of physicalism. So when someone is saying something there is an assumption that they can't prove scientifically. They can't prove it scientifically.
Not one unitary self that's
There you go.
Yeah.
You can't prove it scientifically because it's your assumption, right? And that needs exploration and that needs discussion. And there's a lot of debate amongst the physicalists and the non-physicalists in terms of what is the first principles of the metaphysics that we should use to understand the neurobiological studies, or even to understand what makes us human, which is the fact that we have inner subjective conscious states. So if anyone takes anything from this, is understand that wherever you see in the science that there's going to be an assumption there, and that assumption is going to be a non-scientific one.
Okay.
And that requires philosophical investigation.
Right, fair enough. Just to wrap up now, I'm going to ask you just one last question. Obviously, the viewers know you're a Muslim. If they don't know, they probably know now you're a Muslim. And why or how do you now link this argument to Islam? Do you link it? If you do, what you trying to show? What's
Well, interestingly, I mean, this is probably not the best video to basically start showing the coherence of Islam. But the thing is, you know, Allah says in the Quran, God says in the Quran that, you know, the soul, the ruh, is the command of your Lord, and you've been given very little knowledge. So this whole argument could just prove that verse, which is we just don't know.
Yeah.
We don't know why inner subjective conscious states arise from physical processes. We don't know what it's like for Imran to have an inner subjective conscious state. And is consciousness the same as the soul anyway? These are big questions that we may never know much about anyway. However, what is interesting is the first principles of Islam, or one of the first principles, is that we have a fitrah. A fitrah in English means the primordial state, the innate disposition. And that is something that's been created by God, and it has a form of knowledge, proto knowledge or primary knowledge. And that knowledge is that God is a reality and that He's worthy of worship. And this is within us. But over time, and because of parenting and socialization, it gets clouded.
Right.
So, you know, in order to basically awaken the truth within, that God is a reality and that He's worthy of praise or worship, in order to awaken that, you have to basically engage with revelation, you have to start thinking, you have to maybe have spiritual experiences, a whole set of things that can awaken the truth within, uncloud your primordial state, uncloud your innate nature to awaken the truth within. Now, the reason I'm mentioning this, because the whole concept of the hard problem of consciousness or inner subjective conscious state makes sense of the fact that we have an innate disposition, that we have an inner self in some way, yeah? It makes sense, doesn't it? Because if it was just all neurochemicals firing, then maybe we shouldn't even be raising these questions in the first place, you know?
That would make full
That's
sense.
the point, yeah, because when it comes to this first principle of Islam, it is very first person.
Yes.
Because I have an innate disposition and I have knowledge within me.
Yes.
Some kind of proto-primary knowledge that God is a reality and He's worthy of worship. Now that necessarily is not a philosophical position, it's an innate position from the point of view that it is part of me, right? So that just makes sense. So the fact that we have consciousness, it makes sense of the fact that we have an innate disposition. I know there's a very loose link I've made,
No, we're going to do another
we could do another
on
video
the
on this.
fitrah itself.
But yeah, I mean, look, even in the Islamic classical traditional point of view, many scholars would argue, many may even argue a physicalist position. They would argue there is something about the brain and the physical that God made in order for us to have consciousness, but we just don't know.
Yeah.
So to be very, very fair, we don't even have to disagree with Sam Harris. Maybe the only thing we'll disagree with him on is the fact that he's denying a self.
Yeah.
But he's just echoing maybe Dan Dennett. I think he wrote the book in 1991, and I know his views have become more nuanced and they've changed. I think it was 1991. It was called Consciousness Explained. That, as the philosopher of the mind, Antti Revoncio, he says, you know, he cites other philosophers of the mind, and he says that they say that his book, Consciousness Explained, should have been called Consciousness Explained Away, because he's denying that which makes us human, which is the fact that we have inner subjective conscious experiences.
Right.
You can't just say it's an illusion.
I think you've given us a lot to think about, especially the people watching. So thank you for coming on. And everyone, thank you for watching. So if you enjoyed the show, where could they get your book from, by the way? Because I'm sure they'll probably want to read this particular chapter and other chapters.
They can get it from Amazon.
Amazon and anywhere else?
And Wordery.
Wordery, and that's pretty much it, right?
I think so, yeah.
Okay, and your website is?
HamzaZordis.com.
Okay,
There's lots of
HamzaZordis.com.
essays on there.
Brilliant. And make sure to subscribe and click the notification bell. Until next time, take care.